Hi everybody, my name's Karen. I'm a youth instructor at the Colorado Mountain Club's Youth Education Program. And today we're going to do an experiment about mountain weather and the weather specifically here in Colorado. So before we get started on our experiment, if you are following along and doing this experiment with me, the things you'll need is a clear rectangular bucket that's about halfway full with room temperature water. You'll need 2 cups, one that's got hot water with some red food coloring in it, and then one that has cold water with some blue food coloring in it. You'll need a bucket of rocks. You don't need a ton, you just need enough to make kind of a line of rocks inside of your bucket, which we'll get to in a minute. And additionally, you'll want the mountain barriers worksheet and a pen or a pencil to write along on that worksheet with me. So I'm going to move this to the side. Before we get started on our experiment, let's talk a little bit about what weather is. So take a second, think of a couple examples of weather that you might see outside your window right now, maybe have noticed in the past few weeks, or maybe your favorite kind of weather. So some examples you might have come up with are sunny weather, snowy weather, rainy weather, windy weather, all sorts of things like that. So when we think about weather, it's a pretty big topic, and basically what weather is just the daily changes in our atmosphere that happen every day. So sometimes we can wake up and it's super warm and sunny, other times it's really cold, and here in Colorado the weather is super crazy. So when we talk about weather as a whole, it's really helpful to look at our weather systems in the whole country of the US. So usually we find that our big weather systems, those big areas where our big movements of hot or cold weather originate with, is over the ocean. So where it's colder is up in the Pacific Northwest area of America. We've got like Washington, Oregon, borders with Canada. And that's where a lot of our cold weather comes from. So we would call that a cold front. It's got a lot of cold air. Usually we'll see that snow and rain can come from things like that, along with just super cold days. And then over here in the Gulf of Mexico, we find that that's where a lot of our warm weather comes from. So for warm weather, we would call that a warm front that can bring our nice sunny days and our warm temperatures. So we'll keep that in mind as we look at Colorado. So let's find Colorado on our map here. Right over here, this is our nice rectangular state of Colorado. So we're in an interesting spot. We're kind of in between those cold fronts that come up from the Pacific Northwest and the warm fronts that are coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. So when we think about Colorado weather, it's really important to think about how our cold fronts and our warm fronts kind of push together and come to create some interesting effects here in Colorado. So go ahead and pause the video for a second and fill out the first 2 questions on your worksheet. First question, like we just discussed, is what is weather? So give a couple examples of your favorite kind of weather or some weather we discussed. And then I want you to think about what might affect weather here in Colorado. So hopefully you've had a second to fill out that worksheet. So Colorado weather is pretty interesting because we've got this really cool range of mountains called the Rocky Mountains that run straight down Colorado and kind of like split it into 2 different sections. So the next thing I want you to look at on your worksheet is that nice little rectangular box, and ask you to draw Colorado. So I want you to label where Denver is, or Golden or Boulder if you're living in those areas. And then go ahead and draw the Rocky Mountains where you think they are moving through Colorado. And then once you've done that, you want to go ahead and label your map with the cardinal directions, so north, south, east, and west. That's going to help you stay oriented on your map. And then once you've got those directions, thinking about that map that I just showed you where we've got our cold air coming in and our warm air coming in, I want you to think about where you think cold fronts and warm fronts move into Colorado, and then draw where you think those come into Colorado on your map. Great, so I've got a little blown up map of Colorado right here. So let's go over what your map might look like and what I've got drawn right here. So I've got my map of Colorado right here. I've labeled my direction. So north is going to be at the top, west is going to be over here, south is down at the bottom, and east is over here. So now that I know kind of the orientation of my state, I went ahead and drew the Rocky Mountains, and they run vertically down the state of Colorado, and we've got Denver over here. So Denver's a little bit away from the mountains, but you can still kind of see them from Denver. You might notice that if you live in Denver. If you're up in a high building, you can usually see kind of how the Rockies run straight down Colorado, which is super cool. So I've got my Rocky Mountains. Again, they kind of like split the state, which is a good thing to think about as we move into our experiment. And then I've drawn my cold weather. That's coming from the northwest side of Colorado. So again, it's blowing in from the Pacific Northwest, moving into the northwest side of the state. And then over here on the southeast side, this is where my warm air comes in from the Gulf of Mexico. So go ahead and take your map and leave it next to you. So I'm going to put mine the way that I'm going to build my experiment. All right, so as we move into our experiment, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be seeing how the warm and the cold fronts of air actually move in Colorado, to see how the mountains might affect how our warm and cold fronts of weather get to interact with each other. So the first thing I want to do is look at my nice rectangle box. Consider that this is a little interpretation of the state of Colorado. And I want to label the sides of the state. So again, I want to orient myself just like I oriented myself with the map. So for me, my north side is going to be here, my east side is going to be here, my south side is going to be here, and my west side is going to be here. So once you've oriented your map so you know which sides you have, I want you to go ahead and using your stones, I want you to draw what you have on your map using stones to make like a 3D version inside the water in your container. So for example, I'm going to start with a little stone, just a little one, kind of this size, and I want to make my Denver. So on my map, my Denver is going to be right about here. Just one stone is going to be good for Denver or Golden, wherever you are living at. After I've got Denver, I want to start building my mountain range. You can take some time on this. You want to stack your mountain range so it's nice and sturdy. And like I mentioned earlier, the Rockies are pretty crazy because they really do kind of split our state. So we want to make sure our mountain range is super sturdy. And the Rocky Mountains, if you've ever been into the mountains and you've seen them, they're pretty tall. So I'm going to put a couple different layers of rock to build up my mountain range. So while I'm working on my mountain range, you can go ahead and pause this video and work on your mountain range as well. Alright crew, so hopefully you've got your mountain range built. It should look something like mine, it doesn't have to be exactly the same. But we want to make sure that our mountain range again is like pretty sturdy and it's pretty tall. So you can see that mine pretty much comes up to the top of the water, creating a really nice barrier of mountains just like we have here in Colorado. So as we move into our experiment, important thing to note is that we're going to be using hot and cold water. And for this experiment, hot water acts just like hot air or like a warm front would act in real life, and our cold water acts in the same way that cold air would act. So it's got the same properties, so it'll either kind of stay high or move low in the same way that air would move in the atmosphere. That creates the weather that we have every day. So before I get into my experiment, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be seeing how our warm and cold fronts act here in Colorado. So we're going to be pouring our cold water and our hot water into our bucket and seeing what happens here. So we're going to be pouring our cold water first. So the first thing we need to do before we pour our water is find that northwest corner, just like we have in our map. That's where our cold fronts usually come into Colorado. So my northwest corner is right over here. So take a second, find your northwest corner, make a little marker, make sure you know that's where you're going to pour your cold water. After we've determined where we're going to pour our cold water, we need to figure out where we want our warm water and our warm front to be coming from. So again, check back to your map, check out where is the southeast corner of my bucket, my Colorado bucket right here. So my southeast corner is going to be right over here. So that's where I'm going to pour my warm water. So let's watch really closely, or if you're doing this experiment on your own, go ahead and pour your cold water first into the northwest corner. We'll pour it nice and slowly. And we'll start to see how our cold water acts. I'm going to leave my cold water right there. So the first thing I noticed looking at this is that my cold water is basically over here. My cold front's seeping a little bit over, but most of my cold front is staying over here. Next, I'm going to take my warm water and I'm going to pour it over here. Let's see what happens here. So if you look down a little lower into your bucket, you'll notice that your warm water starts to rise up a little bit and your cold water starts to sink pretty low down. What we're seeing here is some bleeding and transfer of my warm and cold fronts. My warm air is kind of lifting up and floating over the mountains, and my cold air is staying lower down. So what we can notice here about Colorado weather is that the cold weather that we see in the mountains of Colorado typically doesn't move so much over to Denver. It sticks a lot in this side of Colorado that's more to the west. So what we see here in Colorado is pretty interesting with our weather. Our cold weather tends to stay and kind of be blocked by the mountains. So that's why we have days in Colorado where it snows a lot in the mountains. And if you're like me and you live in Denver, then you don't get a lot of snow in the city, even though you're super, super close to the mountains. So what happens is that our mountains kind of trap our cold fronts. And if they do start to lift up towards the mountains, it's called orographic lift, where our cold weather starts to be lifted up and kind of pushed over the mountains by a front of weather that comes in. What we'll notice is that as our weather starts moving higher and higher, our cold front moves up to kind of try to push over the mountains. Our weather gets kind of tired. I like to say our snow gets pretty lazy. You can imagine if you were hiking a big mountain and you had a big backpack that was full of a bunch of snow and rain and cold weather, you'd get pretty tired. And the same thing happens with our cold fronts. They get really cold and they drop a lot of their moisture, their snow and their rain onto the mountains. So by the time they get over to Colorado, there's usually not a ton of moisture left to drop off in the Denver area. So that's why we say that Denver and the Front Range is kind of in a rain shadow compared to the mountains that are right next to it.